There's a stage almost nobody notices when it's actually happening because on the outside, everything looks completely fine. The empath is still showing up, still answering texts, still smiling in the group chat, still helping when asked, still keeping the peace the way they always have. Nothing about their behavior seems to change, and that's exactly why this stage slips past everyone. Because underneath that steady, familiar surface, something is quietly rearranging itself for good. The warmth that used to pour out of them automatically, the kind of emotional generosity that never needed to be asked for, starts to slow down. Not disappear all at once, just slow. The messages become less frequent. The enthusiasm that once lived naturally in their voice becomes quieter. The little gestures that used to happen without thought suddenly require effort, and sometimes they simply don't happen at all. Nothing dramatic necessarily takes place. There may be no argument, no obvious betrayal, no single moment that explains the change. Instead, the emotional atmosphere begins shifting almost imperceptibly, like a room becoming colder, while nobody notices the window has been left open. At first, the other person may not even recognize what's happening. They might tell themselves that life has simply become busy. Maybe the person is stressed, distracted, tired, overwhelmed, or dealing with something privately. And sometimes those explanations are completely true. Human beings naturally go through periods where their emotional availability changes. But when the shift continues, when warmth becomes consistently restrained rather than temporarily interrupted, something deeper may be happening beneath the surface. The person who once gave freely may begin measuring what they give. They think twice before sending the message. They hesitate before expressing affection. They stop offering reassurance automatically. They may still care deeply, but their behavior starts carrying a layer of caution that wasn't there before. The emotional door hasn't necessarily been slammed shut. It has simply stopped standing wide open. This is often what happens when someone has been emotionally generous for a long time without feeling equally understood, valued, or emotionally safe. Eventually, the mind begins protecting what the heart used to give away without hesitation. A person can spend months or even years offering patience, attention, reassurance, understanding, encouragement, and affection. If those efforts repeatedly go unnoticed or are treated as something guaranteed, they can eventually become emotionally exhausted. And emotional exhaustion doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like someone becoming strangely calm. Sometimes it looks like fewer questions, fewer explanations, fewer attempts to repair misunderstandings. The person isn't necessarily trying to punish anyone. They may simply be reaching the point where they no longer have the emotional energy to keep proving how much they care. This distinction matters because people often assume that a reduction in warmth means a reduction in feeling, but those two things aren't always identical. Someone can still care while becoming less willing to express that care in the same way. In fact, sometimes emotional withdrawal happens precisely because the feelings became too complicated, too painful, or too exhausting to keep caring openly. The person may begin asking themselves questions they avoided before. Why am I always the one reaching out? Why do I feel responsible for keeping this connection alive? Why do I feel anxious whenever I stop trying? Why does giving so much leave me feeling empty? These questions can quietly change the entire emotional dynamic. Once someone starts recognizing an imbalance, they often stop participating in it automatically. They become more observant. Instead of immediately reacting, they watch. Instead of filling every silence, they allow the silence to exist. Instead of explaining themselves repeatedly, they become comfortable leaving certain things unsaid. And this can be confusing for the person on the receiving end. They may suddenly notice how much emotional effort had been happening in the background, the constant check-ins, the thoughtful messages, the patience during difficult moments, the reassurance after insecurity, the way certain conversations were kept alive even when they naturally could have faded. When all of that becomes quieter, the absence can be surprisingly loud. That's one of the strange things about human connection. We often become aware of someone's contribution only after they stop making it. When something is consistently available, the brain can categorize it as normal. It becomes part of the environment. The emotional labor disappears into the background because it happens so regularly. Then one day it isn't there. And suddenly the difference becomes obvious. The silence may create an uncomfortable psychological gap. The person who had grown accustomed to receiving warmth may start wondering why the atmosphere feels different. They may replay old conversations, notice changes in communication, or remember moments they previously dismissed as ordinary. This is where reflection begins. Sometimes the person realizes they had taken the connection for granted. Sometimes they recognize that they were emotionally guarded and failed to respond to the affection being offered. Sometimes they understand that they expected the other person to keep giving without ever asking what that giving was costing them. And sometimes the realization comes too late. But even when it doesn't, emotional distance can create an opportunity for both people to understand the relationship more honestly. For the person who withdrew, the slowing of warmth can become an act of self-respect. They begin learning that kindness doesn't require endless self-abandonment. Being emotionally generous doesn't mean constantly ignoring your own needs. Loving someone doesn't mean carrying the entire emotional weight of a relationship alone. Healthy connection requires reciprocity. Not perfect equality every single day, because relationships naturally move through seasons. There will be moments when one person needs more support than the other. But over time, there has to be some sense that both people are participating, both are listening, both are trying, and both recognize the emotional reality of the other. When that balance disappears for too long, even a deeply caring person can begin pulling their energy inward. They stop asking, "How can I make this person feel better?" and start asking, "What do I need to feel emotionally safe here?" That question represents a major psychological shift. It's the movement from external validation toward internal awareness. The person may still love deeply. They may still remember everything. They may still feel tenderness when certain memories surface, but their love no longer automatically translates into unlimited access to their emotional energy. That's an important distinction. Emotional maturity isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming intentional. A mature person can care without chasing. They can love without losing themselves. They can remain compassionate without constantly rescuing. They can offer warmth while still recognizing when their warmth is being taken for granted. And sometimes, ironically, this change is what finally makes the other person understand what they had. When the emotional generosity slows down, the connection becomes visible in a completely different way. The other person may suddenly notice how much comfort was quietly being created around them. They may remember the person who always listened, always encouraged, always tried to understand. What once felt ordinary begins to feel meaningful. But this realization should not automatically be interpreted as proof that someone will return, change, or suddenly become emotionally available. People respond to absence differently. Some reflect, some reach out, some move on. Some only recognize the value of a connection after it has become unavailable. The important part is not predicting what another person will do. The important part is understanding what the shift means. Sometimes warmth slows because feelings have disappeared. Sometimes it slows because feelings have become painful. Sometimes it slows because someone has finally recognized their own emotional limits. And sometimes it slows because a person is changing internally, learning that love should feel like a connection between two people rather than a responsibility carried by one. The quiet reduction in warmth can therefore mark the beginning of something deeper than withdrawal. It can be the beginning of awareness. The person who once gave automatically starts choosing consciously. They become more careful with their energy, more honest about their needs, and more aware of the difference between genuine connection and emotional overextension. And in that silence, something important becomes clear. Real warmth is valuable precisely because it is freely given, not because it is endlessly available. When someone stops offering it automatically, the goal isn't necessarily to make the other person miss them. The deeper transformation is learning to give from a place of choice rather than fear, love rather than obligation, and emotional strength rather than emotional depletion. Sometimes the greatest change in a relationship begins quietly, when the person who once poured everything outward finally turns some of that warmth back toward themselves. Their trust, which used to be given freely, becomes something they measure out carefully now, almost like they're rationing it. The openness that once came so naturally starts getting guarded, piece by piece, until what's left is a version of them that watches more than it participates. They stop chasing closeness the way they used to and start quietly studying the distance instead, noticing it, almost getting used to it. This shift matters more than people realize, because emotionally intelligent people don't just wake up one day and decide to check out. That's not how it works. What actually happens is much slower and much heavier. It's the result of disappointment that kept repeating itself until the pattern became undeniable. Once an empath finally accepts deep down that their kindness is being used instead of appreciated, something in their mind flips into protection mode. They stop over-explaining. They stop reacting to every little thing that goes wrong. They stop begging people to just be honest with them, especially people who already know exactly what their dishonesty is doing. And here's where most outsiders get it completely backwards. They see the empath handling things more calmly and assume they've simply gotten stronger, more mature, more committed to making the relationship work. What's actually happening is the opposite of commitment. The empath isn't toughening up to stay, they're quietly preparing themselves to be okay without it. The silence around them starts to feel different. The energy shifts. That rich, easy warmth that used to fill every conversation begins to fade into something flatter, more distant. This is exactly why so many people only understand what they had once it's already gone. They get so used to constant emotional support, the patience, the understanding, the endless forgiveness, that they start treating it like something permanent, something that will simply always be there no matter how carelessly they treat it. They assume the empath's emotional availability has no limit, that no matter how much hurt they cause, the door will stay open. But that's not how people work. Even someone built almost entirely out of compassion eventually hits a wall. And once an empath reaches that wall, the distance they create afterward is incredibly hard to undo because it wasn't built in a single moment. It was built slowly, layer by layer, out of pain that kept accumulating in silence. By the time an empath actually lets go, the truth is they've usually already been grieving that relationship internally for a long stretch of time, sometimes months, sometimes years, long before anyone on the outside noticed a thing. That's the real reason their goodbye looks so calm, so composed, so final. The real emotional ending already happened somewhere deep inside them, quietly, long before any physical distance became visible to anyone else. One of the biggest mistakes people make with empathetic people is assuming that softness equals weakness. Because someone is patient, forgiving, expressive, and understanding, people start to believe they can be taken advantage of again and again without any real consequence. They mistake gentleness for dependency. They confuse deep compassion with a total lack of awareness. But emotionally intelligent people don't operate the way most manipulators expect them to. Empaths are constantly reading the room, even in moments where they seem completely calm or totally silent. They pick up on small shifts in tone. They notice inconsistencies between what someone says and what someone actually does. They catch the quiet forms of disrespect, the subtle dishonesty, the manipulation hiding underneath a performance of affection. The reason so many empaths put up with unhealthy behavior for far longer than seems reasonable isn't because they don't see it. It's because their instinct is to look for an emotional explanation before they pass final judgment. They try to understand somebody's pain instead of immediately writing them off. They attempt real, honest communication long before they even consider walking away completely. But ongoing manipulation eventually changes the whole emotional equation. When someone keeps lying, keeps controlling, keeps gaslighting, keeps neglecting or exploiting an empath's natural willingness to care, that empath eventually arrives at an uncomfortable but very clear realization: their emotional energy isn't building anything healthy anymore. It's just fueling dysfunction. And that realization becomes the real turning point. Instead of pushing harder, arguing louder, or escalating the conflict, the empath starts to pull back emotionally. And this is precisely the moment where manipulation stops working. Manipulation depends entirely on emotional access. It needs a reaction to survive: fear, guilt, confusion, over-explaining, chasing. A manipulator feels powerful specifically because they can move somebody else's emotions like a lever. But once the empath stops reacting the way they used to, that lever breaks. The manipulator loses their grip completely, and that sudden calm often throws people off because they mistake stillness for surrender. In reality, that stillness is what full emotional detachment looks like from the outside. The empath isn't trying to be understood by that person anymore because they've already come to understand the situation clearly on their own. Their whole focus shifts away from saving the connection and toward protecting their own peace of mind instead. This shift is powerful precisely because someone who's emotionally detached becomes almost impossible to manipulate. The empath stops needing constant reassurance. They stop arguing for basic honesty. They stop giving up their own peace just to keep an unhealthy dynamic alive. Instead, they quietly start putting up boundaries while observing everything from a safer emotional distance. And the more mature this process becomes, the less power manipulation holds over them going forward. They start spotting toxic patterns faster. They learn to trust what people actually do far more than what people say. They start valuing real, steady consistency over short bursts of affection that never last. This change tends to shock the people around the empath, because those people had quietly grown dependent on that endless patience without ever really noticing it. They expected the forgiveness to keep coming, the understanding to keep flowing, the emotional availability to never run out. But once the empath disconnects internally, the whole atmosphere changes. The warmth becomes limited. That easy access disappears completely. The predictable reactions simply stop happening, and the person who used to feel completely in control of the emotional dynamic suddenly starts experiencing something unfamiliar: real insecurity, sudden anxiety, and a heavy sense of regret because they can no longer steer the emotional temperature of the relationship the way they used to. What makes all of this even more significant is that empaths rarely announce any of it out loud. There's no big speech, no dramatic declaration. They simply become quieter, calmer, and completely unavailable to behavior that used to affect them deeply. Their greatest strength turns into a kind of emotional discipline. They stop wanting revenge. They stop chasing closure. They stop needing dramatic confrontations to feel resolved. They've come to understand something simple but powerful. Protecting their own peace matters more than trying to force loyalty out of someone who never respected their feelings in the first place. One of the most unsettling realizations anyone can have is discovering that an empath they once took for granted has fully withdrawn from their life. Most people expect emotional withdrawal, or even revenge, to look loud and dramatic. Angry outbursts, big confrontations, something destructive. But the real power an empath holds shows up in exactly the opposite way, the moment they simply stop participating in the emotional dynamic altogether. Unlike manipulative people who thrive on chaos, guilt, and loud conflict to maintain control, an empath who's finally reached their limit almost always chooses quiet and distance instead. And that silence carries enormous weight, because the empath was usually the emotional center of the entire relationship. They were the one who listened during hard times. They were the calm, steady voice in the middle of conflict. They noticed the small emotional details everyone else overlooked. They were the constant source of patience and reassurance, all while quietly carrying their own struggles that nobody else ever really asked about. Over time, people can become deeply dependent on that steady flow of emotional support without ever fully valuing where it came from. They get comfortable receiving real loyalty without offering the same emotional safety back. So when the empath finally reaches that point of total emotional exhaustion, everything shifts permanently. The easy access people once had disappears. The empath stops reacting to obvious manipulation. They stop arguing, stop pleading for basic understanding, stop over-explaining their feelings, and they stop sacrificing their own peace to keep something unhealthy alive. At first, this quiet often gets misread as temporary frustration, something that will blow over. People assume the empath will eventually come back around to the same level of availability as before. But withdrawal like this is almost never impulsive. It's nearly always the final stage of a long, slow buildup of disappointment. By the time the empath finally steps back for good, they've usually already spent months quietly processing betrayal, disappointment, and emotional fatigue on their own without saying a word about it. That's exactly why their calm feels so complete, so controlled, so permanent. They're not fighting to hold on to the relationship anymore because they've already made peace with what it actually was. What makes this dynamic so powerful is a simple but often ignored truth. Someone's absence can reveal their real value far more clearly than their presence ever did. While the empath was constantly giving emotional support, most people never fully registered how much stability and comfort they were actually receiving day to day. But the moment that support disappears, the resulting emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. Conversations feel colder, the steady reassurance is gone. That deep sense of being understood vanishes completely. And suddenly, the same person who once overlooked everything the empath gave starts to feel the full emotional weight the empath had been quietly carrying on their behalf, sometimes for years. This shift creates real discomfort because people so often only recognize what mattered after they've permanently lost access to it. There's a dangerous misconception a lot of people hold about deeply empathetic individuals. They assume gentleness equals weakness. They believe patience is the same thing as passivity. They confuse genuine forgiveness with submission, and they mistake emotional kindness for a lack of awareness. But what most people don't understand is something much deeper. Empaths aren't fragile just because they feel things intensely. In truth, they carry real strength because they survive emotional situations that would completely break most other people. And the moment you push someone that deeply empathetic past their true limit, something inside them changes for good. It doesn't happen loudly. It doesn't happen with drama. It happens quietly, coldly, and permanently. The most dangerous version of an empath isn't the emotional one, it's the one who's become fully detached. Empathetic people spend their whole lives reading human behavior. Even in complete silence, they're constantly paying attention. They notice small changes in tone, sudden shifts in energy, fake concern, forced affection, disrespect disguised as casual comments, and manipulation dressed up as love. They pick up on things other people completely miss because high emotional intelligence naturally trains someone to notice inconsistencies. That's exactly why so many empaths stay quiet longer than anyone expects. Not because they're unaware, but because they're quietly gathering evidence. People assume an empath keeps forgiving because they're naive. That's completely wrong. Empaths almost always see the truth long before they act on it. They just hold on to hope that the other person will choose honesty on their own before the consequences become impossible to reverse. Repeated emotional pain reshapes psychology in a lasting way, especially for someone who feels things with real intensity. At first, an empath tries everything, communicating clearly, explaining how they feel, trying to repair what's broken, asking thoughtful questions, genuinely trying to understand the other side. That's because emotionally intelligent people naturally look for solutions before they even consider separation. But when that effort keeps getting met with dishonesty and manipulation, something in their mind adapts for basic self-preservation. And that's where the real transformation begins. Slowly, the emotional reactions stop. Most people completely misread this stage. They assume the empath is finally calming down, that the conflict has settled. In reality, the empath is systematically disconnecting piece by piece. There's a real psychological difference between genuine peace and emotional shutdown. True peace still carries warmth and openness. A shutdown creates distance that's nearly impossible to break through. And once that kind of detachment fully sets in, the relationship has already entered its final chapter, whether anyone admits it or not. Every real connection depends on mutual emotional investment. The moment an empath decides to stop investing their feelings, the entire structure holding that relationship together collapses quietly, without a scene, without an announcement. What makes this especially dangerous for the manipulator is that their entire sense of power depends on being able to trigger a reaction. They feed on arguments, on tears, on desperate explanations, on being chased. Those dramatic responses are what reassure them that they're still steering the emotional dynamic. So when the empath suddenly becomes calm and quiet instead, something genuinely unsettling happens on a psychological level. All of that control disappears at once. The manipulator can no longer predict how the empath will respond, and that loss of predictability creates a kind of anxiety they've never had to deal with before, because for the first time, they're no longer the one holding the emotional reins.